Hey, Nate,
Yeah, Sam.
do you have dry earwax or wet earwax?
I don't know. I never really thought about it.
Well, apparently there's a genetic test that you can get that will tell you.
Really? What else can these things tell you?
I think they can tell you a lot, but are they even reliable?
I don't know.
Hey,
I got a question about that. Welcome to another episode of Hey, I Got a Question About That.
I'm Sam.
I'm Nate, and this is a podcast and video series where we talk about all the fascinating research going on here at the Penn State Eberly College of Science.
And today on the pod, we're joined by Cheryl Keller. She's an associate research professor of biochemistry and molecular biology, and Cheryl studies gene regulation during blood cell development.
Yeah, and we talked to Cheryl about direct-to-consumer genetic testing, so let's check it out.
So today we are joined by Cheryl Keller. She's an associate research professor of biochemistry and molecular biology here in the college. Welcome to the podcast, Cheryl.
Thanks for having me.
So can you start by telling us a little bit about your research?
Sure. Yeah, we study blood cell development in mice, and we use that as a model system to learn more about blood development in humans. And blood is critically important for human health. It carries oxygen and carbon dioxide back and forth to various tissues in your body, all your tissues in your body. And so it plays a major role, and if you interfere with the normal process of, blood cell development and the way blood functions, it can lead to various diseases. And some of the diseases that you may be familiar with might be sickle cell disease, in which the blood cells don't form properly because of a mutation in a protein called hemoglobin, which binds the oxygen. And those people who have sickle cell disease have trouble getting enough oxygen to their tissues, and can be very sick and have lower quality of life. And so by learning about how blood is normally made and those processes, then we can learn more about disease processes and how to improve human health and how to treat those diseases.
Cool. And there's testing for things like sickle cell disease, right? Like genetic testing?
Yes. So there's, of course, many different kinds of diseases, but one thing about sickle cell disease is that it's due to a very specific mutation in one gene. So it's a very easy disease to test for because it's really only one gene that's affected. And so, yeah, that can be done in very early, anytime in life. It disproportionately affects individuals of African descent. So they are at greater risk, but it is certainly a testable disease.
So Nate and I were discussing this kind of concept of genetic testing and how it's something that's in the news a lot, especially with direct-to-consumer test genetics and genomics. How reliable are these kind of genetic tests?
That's a good question, and there are certainly a lot of medical tests that you would, if you're testing for disease, there's a lot of, you can test chromosomes and you can test, so it's different. So for example, Down syndrome, those individuals usually have an extra chromosome 21 or a piece of chromosome 21, which leads to Down syndrome, and there's a very reliable genetic test. You can also test for, again, specific gene mutations like sickle cell or Tay-Sachs or hemochromatosis, which is a disease in which you have iron overload, too much iron in the blood. And so those sorts of diseases, the tests are very reliable. As long as the actual lab, which is performing the test, is a certified laboratory, and those results are very trustworthy and reliable. You can also actually test for, instead of actually testing DNA or chromosomes, you can test for different enzymes or level of proteins in the blood, which may reflect a genetic disease that you have. So, in that case, people will use genetic testing. For example, they test newborns for a variety of diseases when they're born, especially ones where you need critical care early on to treat a disease in order to, save that newborn's life. So there are diseases that get tested for very early. Again, these are all very reliable and established tests. You can also do diagnostic tests if an individual, and some diseases, may occur later on in life, and those, if you want to rule out or confirm a specific disease, again, when you're talking about medical testing, very reliable, established tests are available. And there's a few other types of situations where you may want to do genetic testing. Nowadays, we're getting to the point where we're doing some pre-implantation genetic testing, where people are doing in vitro fertilization, and they may test. Let's say the parents are carriers for some genetic diseases, and they really want to have a healthy child and avoid that genetic disease. And you can, if you're doing in vitro fertilization, at the very early on in development, you can take out a cell and test those embryos to see whether or not that embryo is carrying the genetic disease. So again, there's certainly medical testing, which is very validated and plays an important role in human health. Today, we're seeing with the advent of a lot of direct-to-consumer testing, and those tests, unlike medical tests where you need usually a prescription from your doctor and your doctor orders it, direct-to-consumer tests are tests available from companies that you may see advertised online, in print, or, and those, there's pros and cons, benefit and risks, really.
Before we get too deep into that, so some of the examples you gave, like Tay-Sachs and sickle cell disease, I think, so the relationship between the genetic mutation and the disease is very straightforward, right? It's very predictive.
Yes.
Even things like there's a lot of testing for things like the breast cancer genes, BRCA1 and BRCA2, which can be very predictive, but they're sort of not, there's not that straightforward one-to-one relationship, because a lot of breast cancer is caused by something other than those genes, right?
Correct.
So how do those type of tests differ as far as how people should be interpreting them, maybe?
Good question. Well, so again, tests that might look for diseases that due to, let's say, Tay-Sachs or that we talked about, and the reliability of those, like I said, are very accurate because the disease is due to a mutation in one single gene. Okay, so that makes it either a yes or no. You either have the disease or you're not, or you're not from the most part. Whereas in mutations that put you at risk for other diseases like breast cancer with the BRCA1 and BRCA2 mutations, that may increase your risk, but it does not mean you're going to get the disease. And that's important. And I think that's where some of the confusion and over interpretation, in test results. And because your lifestyle, it's known that lifestyles play a factor, diet and exercise, sleep, those stress can all play a role in whether or not, you may actually go forward and develop cancer. And so by testing some of these, the presence for some of these mutations the benefits really is you could make some decisions that can affect your health and maybe try to make better lifestyle choices, which is very hard for people to make lifestyle changes. But it can also put people, add to your stress, and perhaps very unnecessary stress, because you may then be worried about a disease that you may never get.
Why would people want to do these direct-to-consumer tests, and what kind of information are they getting from them?
That's a good question. So I actually have done my own from 23andMe. This was years ago. And I'll talk a little bit about my experience to then answer your question about the kinds of things you can learn and why people might do that. And back when I did it, it was before the FDA kind of started cracking down on the kind of information that these companies could give you. And by information, I mean how they are interpreting the results and what kind of conclusions they're making based on your results. And so there are several sections. So first, one thing that people use for both 23andMe and Ancestry.com is to learn about their ancestry. And I'm not an expert in ancestry, but that's a really interesting, one interesting way of kind of learning more about your family tree and your family origins. So I think a lot of people are interested in that, and certainly it's a good tool to try and search out your family history. And so that my results made sense. I have my maternal grandparents were from Poland a couple generations back, and I had a very strong Eastern European presence in my my genome, my ancestry results. So that made sense to me. So that's one reason people do it. Then you can, otherwise they will, now, like I said, they've cracked down a little bit, but they will still provide you with certain, your carrier status. In other words, so are you carrying different variants or mutations that would mean you're you're at risk for developing a specific disease. Again, they do test for the BRCA1 and BRCA2 mutations. They will also look at different variants that are implicated in Alzheimer's disease. But again, that is also not a one-to-one correlation. You can be at increased risk depending on what APOE allele you have, but there's actually one of them is even a little protective. So here's the interesting thing to think about with a lot of these tests is, let's say you have one variant that is causing let's say is associated with a 5% increase in risk of disease. And then you have a variant that's associated with a 5% decrease risk of that disease. What does that mean?
You're safe, right? Balance
yeah,
out.
sure, yeah. But it's not really that simple. And I think, a lot of these tests are really only, or these companies, they're looking at essentially a handful of spots in your genome and trying to make predictions based on that. But they're really not looking at complete information. Also, a lot of other information that you can get from these tests would be different traits, like how well do you process caffeine? Are you a likely sprinter? And this is interesting. We can talk a little bit more about some of these more lifestyle-based interpretations, but there is one actin gene that if you don't have any working copies of this actin, so this actin gene is associated with, they call it the gene for speed. And
those are the proteins that make up your muscle fibers.
Yes,
right?
yes, sorry, yeah. And most elite power athletes and sprinters have 2 working copies of the actin gene, whereas if you look at more elite distance runners, they do not. I myself am a distance runner, and I found out that I do not have working copies of that gene. So, but there's really no disease affected,
right,
by the lack of that copy of the gene. But you can also learn a little bit more about yourself, of whether or not you may be lactose intolerant, or your likelihood of being lactose intolerant. Then there's some kind of silly ones as far as whether you might have a widow's peak. And this is interesting because I actually do have a widow's peak. And my 23andMe results suggest that I am very unlikely to have a widow's peak. So I think that that's really something just right there. And then you need to take it with a grain of salt. And I've looked through my results, and I think you need to, some of them I feel like are spot on.
Yeah.
And other ones I feel I'm looking at like, what? So I think that is a clue right there,
right,
that again, the information is not complete.
One of my favorite ones that I've heard people talk about is earwax. There's some apparently genetic component of whether you have waxy
wet earwax or
yeah.
I forget. I think unlikely, but I could be wrong.
I wonder if they found the gene for our baldness yet.
Oh.
There probably are. I'm sure there are alleles that lead you to increased likelihood of baldness.
Right. There's a red hair gene, right?
Nowadays, they're actually coming out. There's a lot more companies. Again, so 23andMe was one of the early ones that had this direct-to-consumer testing. Now there's some additional ones that are stepping a little bit further outside more medical-associated types of risks and traits. So, for example, ones that may offer or predict to offer you personalized nutritional advice. And again, they're only really looking at, if you want to think about a handful, it's like sampling, not quite grams of sand on the beach, but kind of close,
right.
Where they're just looking at a handful of different genes and variants and saying, oh, well, you don't process fats well, or, oh, you don't process carbohydrates well. And they're making predictions on basically what, types of foods you can eat. And let me be clear that there's no evidence for that those predictions have any evidence,
right,
really. And I think that in that case, it's a lot of those kinds of tests are a little more than guesswork.
And then do people who get these test results also get, sort of nutritionist designed diets or anything?
Yeah. Oh, and of course they are willing to sell you diet plans based on your genetic tests. And I think the problem is the public is misled into thinking that these results or these predictions have a lot of value, where they really have, these companies are offering this information and making these predictions, but the science is not there to back it up.
So I'm curious, since you said you did 23andMe a little while ago, do they continue to update when new science is available so that you have access to all the latest and greatest sort of predictions that they're making?
I do. I actually have access to all my old reports, which are, again, a little more extensive and a little more, I don't want to say, I guess speculative is the right word, before the FDA made them go through and more rigorously validate, their tests. But they do go ahead, they will update that. And if they find information, they will update your risk. Again, though, sometimes you can see your risk go up or go down. Before I had what's this? Before I had a 5% decrease in risk, and now I have a 10% increase in risk. Obviously your risk hasn't really changed. It's just the report of risk has changed. So that's why it's really kind of important to take a step back and understand that there's a lot of uncertainty out there.
So if I get one of these tests done and it says I'm at an increased risk for Alzheimer's, should I take these results to my doctor?
So talking to your doctor would be a great first step. And I think, again, that diseases which have a strong lifestyle component, there's really no need to panic. And I think that really, regardless of your genetic background, everyone could benefit from making solid, lifestyle changes for the better. So I think but talking to your doctor about what they feel is your actual risk based on your personal medical history and family history, whether or not, how much that might impact you.
Do you think that having this kind of information available, though, is going to cause a change in how doctors have to do their business? Like, I imagine most doctors aren't necessarily trained as genetic counselors so that they might not have the background to interpret this stuff any better than your average consumer. Sure.
That's a really good point. And I think, and I don't want to give the impression that I disagree with the availability of these tests. Personally, I think it's fantastic and I love having access. And I've actually combed through my own raw data, not uninterpreted data, to look for specific variants or evidence of disease or variants associated with disease. And I have actually educated my own doctor about one or two things that I wanted to bring up and discuss about whether he felt that we should keep an eye on. So I think that we are moving further and further toward personalized medicine, with having these tests available. But I just feel that right now there's a big gap in what's being offered to the consumer and the science to back up changes that you might make.
Right.
Well, if you have that information, is that really going to affect your care, down the road? And we don't really know with having some of this information of whether or not it's really going to make a difference.
So if you find out you have a serious mutation, is there anything that can be done about that? I've heard a lot about gene editing. Is that something that can be done now?
Yeah, gene editing is a really exciting tool that has come more into public and through a technique called CRISPR, again, which is a gene editing tool that's from bacteria. And so there are certain cases, again, that gene editing could be useful in order to treat, or cure disease. And going back to blood, which is, being why I work on blood, is sickle cell disease. And to tell you a little bit more about sickle cell disease, is that it results from a mutation in a protein called a part of a protein called hemoglobin, which carries oxygen. So hemoglobin is made up of 4 different protein subunits. So 4 different little proteins that come together and then they carry oxygen. And there's 2 alpha and 2 beta. And so sickle cell results from a mutation in the beta subunit of hemoglobin. And so that causes the sickling effect in the red blood cell, which makes it difficult to carry oxygen. So when you're an adult, you're making the 2 beta and your 2 alpha, but when you're developing as a fetus, you actually produce 2 alpha and 2 hemoglobin is made of 2 alpha and 2 gamma. So that's a different gene, and that's called fetal hemoglobin. So that's what's expressed before you're born, and then very soon after you're born, you kind of turn on adult expression. And what's interesting, one thing that researchers are trying to do, or have been working on, and are close in some human trials have begun, where they can edit the DNA in some cells which will give rise to red blood cells, because red blood cells themselves don't actually have a nucleus. So you can't actually directly edit red blood cells, but what you can do is edit cells that will develop into blood cells. So stem cells. So if you've heard of stem cells, and there'll be stem cells in the bone marrow. And what they've been trying to do is find ways to increase production or expression of this gamma globin. So in other words, can you take some bone marrow stem cells from an adult who has sickle cell and take them out and do some gene editing to make those cells now express or produce higher levels of hemoglobin, which it doesn't normally do, right? And so there's been a lot of studies in cell culture and in the lab, as well as working with some, like I said, some very early clinical trials where then you can again use this CRISPR, this gene editing tool, and you can make enough of that fetal hemoglobin expression in order to kind of overcome that level of sickling. And you can't, so far they haven't been able to make it to the same level as the adult, but you can kind of overcome that threshold, which would then allow those patients to have a much greater quality of life. So they're really expressing then hemoglobin. So that's like a real world example of what's happening now with gene editing. And by, genetic testing can identify potential genes to do that in the future. But again, I think it's important to realize that right now, gene editing is only going to be useful for those genes which are due to a mutation in one gene, those diseases, right? So if you have lifestyle diseases like diabetes and obesity and so forth, we're not there. There's no real obvious way to do gene editing. But for very specific, serious genetic diseases, that's a real possibility that we should be seeing in our lifetime, I think.
You say you took bone marrow cells out and did the gene editing on them. Do they go back into the body then, or how does that work? So
yeah, then you would do a bone marrow transplant. And I'm not an expert in transplant biology, but in certain cases, you could hopefully then repopulate the bone marrow with these modified gene-edited cells, so that hopefully that they would establish themselves enough. And stem cells, by definition, are cells that can both renew and remake another version of themselves, as well as divide and give rise to other cell types, differentiate to other cells like blood cells. So the idea would be to at least replace a proportion of the patient's affected cells with edited cells, and you would try to find ways to get that to be established at a certain percentage of their bone marrow with the edited cells.
There's sort of a chain of custody of this DNA that's, outside of the lab. So do you think that there's increased risk of contamination or things like that could lead to errors?
So medical testing done through your doctor would be always done by a CLIA-certified laboratory. And what that essentially means is, they've gone through vigorous evaluations and follow vigorous standards to ensure the accuracy of the results. With some of these direct-to-consumer testing, that may not be the case. And I think that that's important to know. And I can't recall the specific instance, but I do have a recollection of hearing a couple stories where someone had heard or gotten their results from a direct-to-consumer company about a particular result for one of the BRCA genes, and actually went forward with a mastectomy, and then found out, in fact, that it was an incorrect test. And so that would be, a huge life-changing decision that one has made that would cause certainly a lot of unnecessary stress and medical procedures, and as well as other things. So I think that there is a risk that some of these direct-to-consumer tests may be inaccurate, but I think that the bigger risk is not so much what the actual result is in terms of the DNA mutation being, A or B versus, A, B, or C, or whatever kind of mutation it is, but the interpretation of that and how that result is going to affect your risk.
And is it an option if I just wanted to know about my ancestry, but can I just get that information, or do I just have to kind of close one eye when I look at the results?
Yeah, so there are. I think Ancestry.com only offers ancestry information. 23andMe will offer ancestry information as well as, some medical type tests, and they do actually. So 23andMe will actually block off some of the genes where people might cause excess worry. Parkinson risk, breast cancer risk, Alzheimer risk, where you can pull up the results of your profile testing, but you actually have to you have to drill down several windows and go through a tutorial and before they'd actually give you the results. So that basically you don't have to look if you don't want to. Some people don't want to know. And I know several people who really don't want to know, and they would rather just go through life and the less you know, then the better. But as a scientist, I like more information, and certain things have caused me probably unnecessary worry from time to time.
So 23andMe and Ancestry.com are sort of doing your entire genome, but I've been seeing commercials for things that are sort of specific tests, one for colon cancer, I think.
Sure, so that would be Cologuard. And that is not actually is measuring is they call cell-free DNA, in your feces, in your stool. Mm-hmm. And what that's actually testing for, so when is perhaps pieces of DNA that might have been shed off of a growing cancer in your colon. And you can actually test using DNA testing to look for pieces of DNA that would be associated with colon cancer. And so the advantage, of course, is you do not have to go through a colonoscopy, which many people have anxiety about. I'm not yet 50, so I haven't had to face that yet. But, so a lot of people are not keen on that. And for low-risk patients, that might be a way to go and test yourself. However, it's important to know that it's not going to pick up precancerous polyps or precancerous changes or other problems that might be occurring in your colon. And so in that respect, the colonoscopy really is the gold standard.
So could you maybe just summarize the direct-to-consumer kind of genetic testing and what people need to keep in mind if they're interested in doing it?
Okay, so for benefits, so you are going to get some very personalized information about your own risks, and I think that can help you make some informed decisions about your care, your personal care, your maybe some medical decisions, and whether or not you should be more motivated to make some important lifestyle changes. And also you can then potentially identify whether you're a carrier, which may affect whether your decision to have children or either your children's risk if you know that you're a carrier for a disease. So I think that there's some benefits. It's simple, it's quick. You don't have to go through a doctor. It's really non-invasive because most of them just use a swab and take some samples inside your cheek. So it's pretty easy and straightforward. It's usually not very expensive. The downside is that the direct consumer testing many of them are unregulated, and you may learn information about yourself that you're not prepared for, that may increase your stress. Perhaps unnecessarily, so that's concerning. There may also be errors, both in the data and in the interpretation. Again, we do not know everything there is to know, and much of what's being offered and interpreted out there is little more than guesswork at this time. And so I think that you kind of need to go in with it with open eyes and, view it a little bit with a grain of salt, depending on what exactly you're trying to find out.
So that was cool.
Yeah, it really seems like these services can tell you a lot about yourself, but you should probably do your own research too.
Right. It was interesting, too, to hear the difference between genetic testing for things like Tay-Sachs or sickle cell disease versus, these direct-to-consumer things that tell you about your nutrition and your earwax.
So if you want to learn more about Cheryl's research or any of the research going on here at the Penn State Eberly College of Science, we will have links in the show notes below.
So thanks for joining us on another episode of Hey, I Got a Question About That. If you haven't already, check out our previous episodes. You can find us wherever you get podcasts or on YouTube. And give us a like, subscribe, and leave us a comment.
The more thunderous voice. Welcome to another episode about these direct-to-consumer... Why do I throw that in there? About these direct-to-consumer... son of a... We talked to Cheryl about direct-to-consumer genetic tests. That's it, Nate. That's all you got to say.
Ready?
I guess.
So that was cool. Make sure you check yourself before you wreck yourself.
That's not that bad. I almost caught the house on fire, though, but other than that, it wasn't that bad.
Hey, Nate.
Yes, Sam?
More pep.
I seriously want to create like a dubstep remix of just you going,
Hey, Nate.
Yes, Sam?
Do you have dry or wet earwax?
Wet.
I wasn't expecting that answer.
How would I even find out? No, that doesn't make any sense. Just stick your finger in your ear.
Are you even listening to us?